One of the most impactful sessions that I went to at Flank this year was put on by one of the textbook companies. I believe it was Wayside, but I'm not really sure. And they kind of labeled it Discover Grammar and Context. This was more affirming than anything for me, seeing as how I've kind of used this method, and I'll explain how a little bit towards the end. But here are the guiding questions for discovering grammar. I want you to consider why we teach grammar to begin with. Traditionally, it's been sort of the core of language education, right? Grammar and vocabulary, but there are certainly other approaches without taking grammar completely out of it, just kind of putting it as a subsidiary approach rather than the primary one. Why do we teach grammar the way we do? Well, of course, the obvious answer is we were taught that way. So we teach the way we were taught, not really considering how research has evolved and what new approaches are out there. How can we make learning grammar more enjoyable for our students? Is that possible? I'm not saying that this method does that completely, but it's something that we should definitely consider. Because typically kids are reticent to learn grammar, and it's not often enjoyable. We as teachers enjoy it way more than they do. And then finally, why is teaching grammar as a concept and used in context? I'll explain on the next slide here. Is inductive reasoning. If you've ever heard of the PACE method or used it yourself, you are already using a discovery grammar approach. I learned about it in college and have used it to some extent, but I'll explain a new method, a new way of approaching it that I've developed for myself at the end. Through this method of discovery grammar, students gain a deeper understanding when they discover the rules with their teacher. So we're working it out together rather than presenting the rules up front and expecting them to immediately apply and practice these rules. Students see how language is really used in real life. The number one thing about discovery grammar is that we provide them extensive examples. I think we can agree that the textbooks, when we used to have textbooks, did not provide sufficient examples before we expected them to use it and apply it. So we have to show them how it's used in real life. If learned in context, they can use it more easily. A lot of these are typically we use discrete sentences or ask them to write discrete sentences, just using whatever the case may be, whatever the concept is we're studying, and it's detached from true meaning, and therefore, when learned in context, it's more meaningful to the students. The fact of the matter is, research has shown that rules and practice does not mean that they're learning the language. They may be learning to some extent, but then when trying to apply it in real life situations, they stumble, they struggle, and they want to go back to completing a worksheet so they can show that they can do it. Most students are not going to be teachers. So what is the point really of teaching these rules for grammar? A lot of times they can't do the same thing in their first language, whether it's English or some other language. Most native speakers, in fact, can't tell you the rules of the grammar they're using. So what's the point? Unless we're training our students to be our replacement someday. So the basic approach is the following, and you'll notice that it's kind of the scientific method. And so when I present it to my students, I present it in that way. We're going to be scientists, grammar scientists for a little while. And I try to draw some comparisons between what scientists do in researching animal behaviors or the growth of diseases in your body, not knowing where the answer is, but just studying, finding patterns, and coming up with hypotheses and then testing those. So here it is, step-by-step approach to discovery grammar. Present text examples and process for meaning. Again, this is the most important part, and we need to provide tons and tons of examples before we get into the methodology behind it. Highlight the target structure. So when I show you my own example, I'll present it as present tense AR verbs, which means nothing to them in the outset, but I want them to know that's kind of where we're going with it. And so I'll highlight the verb or underline the verb to make sure that that's not something that inhibits their understanding. They're going to make observations, trying to pick up on patterns that they see. Then they'll make test hypotheses, make hypotheses before testing them, just kind of laying down their own rules, essentially. And finally, they will apply in real life contextualized situations, going back to their hypotheses and making sure it aligns with what they've said and what they've observed and mirrors the examples that we have. How do we do it? What does it look like? I want to present to you my method, something that I've developed over the course of the last 8 or 9 years, and tell you how it's gone for me. So my basic approach to teaching the discovery method in my class is to use a Freyer model. You've probably used it in some form or fashion in one of your classes too. You always want to start out with plenty of examples. This could be a contextualized paragraph, some sort of reading that you've made up yourself or gotten from some other source. But because we're talking about regular present tense verbs, I'm just going to put a few sample sentences there and attend to the form. Here we see a few basic sentences, just six sentences with each form, but typically it takes a lot more than this. And sometimes, depending on the year and the class makeup, the ability of the students, whatnot, I may break it down even further than this to just attend to one particular subject. For example, the yo form. One year I just took it day by day, a different form each day, so that every day we came back to this idea of discovering how to use the verb conjugations in context. But I want to stress that we should always attend to meaning first. What are these sentences saying? Understand that primarily, and then we can look at the form. Some of these I included the subject pronoun, others I didn't. That was just a subjective decision that I made. You may wish to include it, especially if this is the introduction to this concept. But from here, the students take over. Sometimes I want them to do this individually. Other times I get them to do it in a group. But if we've already done it before, typically like to hand it over to each independent student and let them work through it at their own pace and come up with their own ideas. You're going to see a whole lot of stuff in the observations that may or may not be accurate, but you want to help the students just explain their thinking. Eventually, what you want to get to may be a simple verb chart. Maybe that's when you get to your hypothesis. Sometimes I would provide it for them. And so there, what you are expecting from them is that they draw out how each of these forms end up. You start organizing the information that they see. The observations may deviate from the underlined words. And again, depending on the experience and the ability of the class, you may not want to underline them at all, but it does help initially just to say, this is a verb. We want to focus on what's happening with that verb, having already talked about the fact that it comes from its infinitive, in this case being AR. You going back to observations for a second, you want to discuss it as a class most of the time and ask them, did you come up with the same observations? Look at what this person said about that. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on these observations? And so kind of come to a consensus that these are the consistent things that we're seeing. These are certain patterns. And then you place the patterns into your hypothesis. With the application, I would just give them the verbs that are already there in their infinitive and ask them to write original creative sentences using those infinitives without copying what I already have. This could also lead to doing more of your traditional worksheets and stuff like that. But you want to make sure that everybody has a hypothesis. This is typically where things start to break down, and kids don't want to take the risk. They don't want to look stupid or feel stupid, and so they won't even create their hypothesis. This is where things have to get really hand-on, and you have to encourage them a bit more to push themselves to think a little bit harder about it, and then to try it out and look at what their hypothesis was versus the result that they came up with, and of course the original sentences. So I just want to wrap this up for you with a little, a bit of what I've observed over the years with this method. Number one, it takes a lot of time, especially early on when they're not familiar with what I'm expecting of them, the method itself. It could take up to a week to do it. It's not a day activity, and it never is as long as we do it. As the concepts get more complex, it may extend out and retract, but it takes a lot of time and tons of examples. Kids are oftentimes early on resistant to using the method because they're trained in various classes, maybe with previous foreign language experience, to just get the rules, put it into practice, follow through, and show that they're smart enough. So the high flyers are the ones that typically resist the most, whereas others enjoy the collaboration and working through it and truly understanding it. And finally, I believe in this method. I think it works because even though it takes more legwork, it takes more time, the learning truly is deeper. I don't feel it's necessary to get to the end of a semester or a year and have to review as much because they've worked through it themselves and they just haven't learned it for a test, learned it to complete an activity, things of that nature. I think it's long lasting. And I'd love to talk about it more in depth with you guys if you're interested. So reach out to me and maybe we'll make it even better. Thanks for listening.